It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. 500-year-old Vampire, Jason Cox's cooperative role-playing game, is now shipping, and you should grab your copy if you haven't already. On top of that, there is new crowdfunding campaign on the horizon. In mid-January 2025, look out for Keep the Faith, a role-playing game about building a religion on BackerKit. The designer is Greg Loring Albright, who also designed Ahoy, and I'm very proud to say that I am at work on the curriculum guide, so I'm extra excited about this one. Also, if you want to support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/beyondsolitaire and help me keep the lights on. But for now, let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, it's Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here recording the season finale, actually, of season 9 of the Beyond Solitaire podcast. This is episode 180, and I'm doing it with my good friend and co-designer, Paul Wright. How you doing today, Paul?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Like, I mean, any morning when we're just kind of chilling out is a good morning. But
Yes.
so I decided to be self-indulgent with this episode. And Paul and I are going to talk about a game that we've started working on together, called Foxes and Lions. But since I like to be the one who asks questions, Paul, tell us about Foxes and Lions.
Sure. Well, that's a really long story, but I'll try to do the short version. I'm an academic, I'm a scholar. I focus on Renaissance Italy, particularly Florence and Machiavelli. And I've been thinking and writing and teaching about these subjects for as long as I can remember now. And I've had in the past some game related projects based on this. One was for a role playing pedagogy called Reacting to the Past, which is used in a lot of universities and high schools around the country. So I have a Renaissance Florence game that's in development for that. But then I got the bug about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to do a broader board game that would look at Renaissance Italy as a whole during a period of enormous crisis from 1494 to 1527. The reason for those bookends and those dates I can get into later, but it's such a period of enormous upheaval and stress on the Italian city states of that time that I felt it would be interesting to take a coin inspired, irregular conflict series inspired look at this. And the conceit of the game really is to put the focus on 5 important city states in that period. You have Florence and its republic. It's a very troubled republic. You have the Venetian Republic, a maritime trading empire. You have the Kingdom of Naples, or the so-called Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, as it were. You have Milan, a duchy, and then you have the Papal States centered in Rome. And these 5 powers have often been talked about as kind of essential to the balance of power or the imbalance of power in Italy during this period. And my feeling about games on this subject in the past is that they've always kind of defaulted ultimately to a great power perspective. So the French, the Spanish, the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottomans, even, they tend to get the limelight in these tales of Renaissance Italy. So the thought was to create a 5-player game where these 5 Renaissance city states and their empires, such as they are doing battle with one another and doing battle for their own survival. They are not great powers. So it's a game that involves great powers, but does not have a great power perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Actually, so for those of you who are out there, I'm an expert on classics, but Italy in this period has been a whole new adventure for me. So I now like own the complete works of Machiavelli, and I've been reading, a lot about Italy in this period, and I feel like it's like the more I know about it, the less I realize I ever knew, if that makes sense.
Right.
So now when people talk
Yes,
about Machiavellian politics even, I look at something like The Prince and I'm like, yeah, but also the discourse on Livy. So
absolutely.
if you play, I mean, where we're trying to go with Foxes and Lions, like, how do you think that people who are playing it with their a previous understanding of Machiavelli might change that understanding through the kinds of mechanisms we're trying to put into the game?
That's a great question. On the one hand, the sort of things people associate with the name Machiavelli and associate whether they've read any of Machiavelli or not, right? They associate him with kind of skullduggery, betrayal, treachery of all kinds, backstabbing. And certainly there's lots of room for that in our game. We are not leaving that out of the equation. It would be impossible to talk about Renaissance Italy without that. But the aspect of Machiavelli that is often missed by people, even people who read only The Prince and not the other works like the Florentine Histories or the Discourses on Livy that you mentioned, his great work on republics, people who don't go deeper don't realize that those aspects of treachery and skullduggery, yes, they were of interest to Machiavelli, but he often didn't have complete faith in them. He has whole sections in The Prince and the Discourses about how conspiracies are almost always doomed to fail because somebody talks, somebody spills the beans. So conspiracy never ends up working well anyway. And he had been himself accused of being part of a conspiracy against the Medici when they were restored to power in Florence in 1512, simply because his name was on a list by an actual conspirator. So obviously they were thinking to approach him, but he had done nothing. Didn't change the fact that he got imprisoned for a period of time, tortured, put on the rack, and accused of being a traitor. And then he was released when it was determined he was not involved in the conspiracy. Again, getting to this idea that conspiracies and skullduggery only take you so far. The thing that Machiavelli is really passionate about, the thing he is most interested in, is the potential stability of states and what types of government lend themselves well to what he calls virtù. Virtù is this almost untranslatable Italian word that is about strength, power, force, to be sure, but it's also about strength of character. It's about strength of will. It's about the ability to impose your will on the circumstances around you, which are usually dictated by fortune. And he thought individuals could have virtù, which was definitely his focus in The Prince. But in other works, he stressed that communities have virtù. So, what does it mean for a community or a city state to have virtù and to not only thrive, but survive in the long run? Because he really believed republics in particular were especially fragile. However desirable they are always fragile. And that certainly is a theme right now in our national politics and in our global conversation. So, in that way, Machiavelli and our game, I hope, will be as timely as ever. If you want one great book to look at on this subject of the fragility of states in Machiavelli, it's John Pocock's The Machiavellian Moment. It is really still a masterpiece. It's quite old now, but the argument Pocock makes is that not only is Machiavelli interested in these questions of fragility and stability, but those concerns made their way into what Pocock calls the Atlantic Republican tradition, which includes England in the 17th century, but then eventually the founders of our own United States. So that Machiavellian ideas about stability had made their way almost into the DNA of our founders, who were greatly concerned about the longevity, right, of our republic. And that famous line attributed to Ben Franklin, right? You've got a republic if you can keep it, right? And that really is the abiding question in the game: is whatever regime you have, whether it's feudal aristocracy or a theocracy or a merchant republic, whatever it may be, how do you sustain it? Not just from conquest, but from the threats from within, right? From corruption that erodes institutions and causes states to fall apart.
Oh man, like we can talk about this now. So this is, of course, why I'm interested in being part of this project. But I'm really excited about some of the ways that we're trying to evoke this in our game so far. So like where will the game go in the long run, y'all? We don't know. We don't have this is we're talking about work that is in progress because I think that that's a really cool thing to do. But from my perspective at least, what we're trying to do with the game right now is kind of create that really cloying sense of being left out, like that constant fear that things won't go your way, that you're going to be betrayed, that you don't actually have as much control over your army or over your allies or anything really as you thought you did. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about in that regard. But I want to talk about the fact that there are 5 players in this game and the alliance system that we're working on, because I think that that is the most distinct riff on coin/regular conflict style games that we're messing with right now. And so why not just lead with it? So this
Yeah,
is something you came to me when we started working together with this proposal, but we've been kind of thinking through how it would work. So I'll let you talk through it and then I'll just comment on anything further.
sure. Well, because Machiavelli highlights the five city states that I mentioned earlier, right? Milan, Naples, Venice, the papacy in Rome, and Florence, right? I kind of ran with that. We'll look at those five. The claim was that those five created a kind of balance of power in Italy, particularly under Lorenzo the Magnificent. But our game starts 2 years after he's dead. And our game starts 2 years after that balance of power is clearly falling apart. So having five players seemed to me very important. I didn't want to leave any of those out. And I think you agreed when you jumped on board.
Yeah.
Um, we also thought it would be a really interesting opportunity to create a five-player coin-esque game. And so in the process, we had to think through mechanisms for how the event cards would work and how the eligibility sequencing would work. And it became clear, right, that if you have only four icons for four factions in whatever order on a given event card, and those of you who know coin games know exactly what I'm talking about, then you have a fifth faction that's not necessarily represented on an event. It may be on some, but not on others. And so this creates a natural situation in which you are feeling left out, as you said. So, what do you do to address that? You can make alliances in our game. There are restrictions on how you do it and how you break them. But the basic idea is you pair up your activations. So, in a typical coin game, you have what do they call them? Commands and special activities. We call them orders and deceits, borrowing from Machiavelli's terminology. But in our alliance system, once you've allied, you can combine your deceit, your special, with another partner's order or command, or vice versa. And so it gives you an ability to merge your abilities in a certain way so that you can become more effective on behalf of both factions. Um, of course, the problem built into it, which we want built into it, is only one of the five will win. So there will inevitably come a point where you have buyer's remorse about the alliance you just got into, and you realize it's benefiting my partner way more than it's benefiting me. They're steamrolling to victory thanks to my help. And so maybe it's time for me to break this alliance or create another alliance. We're even talking about ways to create bigger coalitions than just two factions because these coalitions did, in fact, happen. The most famous one being the League of Cambrai, which Pope Julius organized, the warrior Pope Julius organized with a number of powers against the Venetians because they were simply getting too big for their britches, as they say. So the idea of partnerships and the idea of coalitions is something we wanted to build into the game. But we also want dissatisfaction with those arrangements almost immediately because this was typical. I mean, people constantly cut deals, made alliances, and then ended up reneging on those alliances or outright betraying, stabbing in the back their ally. And we think all of these things should happen in the game. But you will need the alliances, surely, at some point in order to get activations, because again, there are five players with event cards only featuring four factions at a time. And remember, in coin, usually only two of the factions on a given card actually do anything on that event card. So there's going to become a real or perhaps sometimes imagined exclusion, right, of certain parties from the flow of action. And that will encourage them to partner up with somebody because then they can share an activation.
Yes, and I do wanna point out that things that we've kind of built in, now that we're in the full on, like, prototyping, like, early test phase. So if you do your special as a pairing to somebody else's events, you maintain eligibility. So it's also a way to maybe get extra actions if you can be patient. Um, and we're also trying to write events that allow you to do things that impact both yourself and an ally, so that basically everything gets a little bit more communal, and therefore both messy and jealousy inducing. um, and so
Exactly.
I very much look forward to all of the spite and pettiness that will inevitably result from all of this. But one thing I think now that I'm talking to you about it, I feel like we've built in, I guess, lots of senses of loss of control or lack of control into the game, which I think does really reflect like Italy at this time. So one of those things is in combat, we have been messing with having commanders, especially mercenaries, who can be bribed or who require continued payment in order to do their job. So, Paul, do you want to talk about like kind of the historical grounding for this and how it's starting to pop up in our game?
Sure. Might help first to know the different unit types you can use in the game. And depending on your primary government, which is the government in your capital, so Naples, for example, you may gravitate towards not only a particular system of government like feudal aristocracy, but also the types of troops that would be produced under that government. So feudal levies are often going to result from aristocracies. You also have the option of citizen militias under certain governmental arrangements, which was something Machiavelli was very fascinated by. He really believed that an armed citizen militia could not only defend the state, but also go on the offensive to expand the state. The great example for Machiavelli being taking Pisa for Florence, which was something Florence was obsessed with for many, many decades. And sometimes they got it and sometimes they lost it. Most of the time they lost it because obviously the Pisans didn't necessarily want to join their little party. But Machiavelli believed a citizen militia could thrive and defend the state and even go on the offensive. This was not a accepted idea by many people because the idea of arming your populace seemed incredibly dangerous. It seemed an invitation to insurrection. So many states were unwilling to do it. So you have feudal levies, you have citizen militias. You can also buy mercenaries without any notable commander, right? You could just buy kind of generic mercenaries. And then what you mentioned, Liz, is you can buy condottieri captains. So you can buy famous named historical mercenary captains from the period, and they will make your mercenaries even more effective. They themselves have combat strength, they have their own companies attached to them. And so the temptation becomes to rely on them because they have a lot of punch within the combat system. The downside being exactly what Liz mentioned, that you can bribe them away. So pretty much anytime a battle's about to happen, you can bribe a mercenary captain to stand down or even switch sides, which was something Machiavelli complained about a lot. He really hated mercenaries because he thought they were mercenary. They were too commercially driven, too driven by profit, and so therefore easy to corrupt. Whereas he thought a citizen militia you couldn't corrupt as easily because they were defending their homeland. So this is a hypothesis of Machiavelli. I want to stress this. It's in the Prince. I'm not saying the game necessarily endorses it. There are many historians who have identified Machiavelli's critique of mercenaries as overdone or underestimating, undervaluing the actual role they played in military affairs of the time. So your mileage will vary, right? Some people agree with Machiavelli's thesis there and others do not. But I think the game can test that thesis in a sense by letting you experiment with the use of these different troop types and seeing how well they gel with your government, how well they gel with your military plans, be they offensive or defensive or both. And so our expectation is people will be availing themselves of all these different types of units when they can. And mercenaries and captains are the only ones everybody can avail themselves of anytime, but it's going to cost you. And you're going to have to keep paying these captains or they will stand down and simply go away until somebody buys them back. Some of the event cards will call an auction for a particular mercenary captain, and it could be that one or more factions have an edge in that auction, or one faction might be excluded from that auction because of the historical animosity between that faction and that captain. But for the most part, we imagine most people being able to bid on whichever captains they want. And they're just going to have to realize it's a long term commitment. It's going to be a lot of money down the road to keep that captain fighting effectively for you.
I do think that's realistic. So, I mean, we are testing Machiavelli's theory. There's not a specific answer about, I guess, the quality of mercenary fight you're going to get. But as a scholar of the period, what is your impression about how mercenaries fought because they were paid? Like, were they just as vicious as anybody else? Did they have kind of rules of combat where, like, they tried to kill fewer people because everybody's just out there doing their job? What do we actually know about how this seemed to work in the field?
So, what Machiavelli describes in The Prince and elsewhere, and what some scholars describe in writing about the condottieri, your mileage varies. I mean, it's not a great answer, but it's a true answer. In some cases, the captains fight valiantly and to the end on behalf of the cause, usually because they're very well paid, sometimes because they also have personal motivations or a personal stake in the fight. They might be fighting against another captain they can't stand. In some cases, a captain, as I said earlier, may have animosity to a faction because, for example, one that was associated with Cesare Borgia, he had Vitelli. His brother had been killed by the Florentines for failing in an attack. And so he never forgave that and he was never going to work with them. So these personal animosities can shape the degree to which a captain fights hard or not so hard. Because what's also described are situations where the captains are facing each other across the battlefield. They're sending couriers, and they basically communicate to one another that we don't need too many people to die here. We don't need to fight too hard. Everybody's getting paid. If we kind of wait things out, winter will come and we'll all be able to go home anyway, or at least go into camp. So let's not rough it up too much here, right? There's no reason to go crazy with this. So it really depended on the search situation, the payment structure, the particular captains and their egos and their grudges, which were sometimes impossible to count. So all of that personal element comes into the game through the mechanisms of the bribery. So there is a powerful economy in the game in general, but there's a specific economy that we already envision being directed to these captains because you will want them. When they fight well, they can make a huge difference in the battle, but they can also let you down. And Machiavelli's worry about them was not just that they fought for money, but that they had no real civic identification with the place they were fighting on behalf of. Whereas he felt, a citizen militia or even feudal levies to some degree, they could at least have a powerful identification with their home. And that would make them fight in a different and more passionate way. Whereas a mercenary is simply in it for the transaction, right? They're very transactional. And so you get what you pay for. But if you stop paying, you're going to get nothing. And someone else is going to steal the captain right out from under you, even right on the eve of battle. So you can be about to start a battle in the game and somebody tries to buy off your captain. We're trying to figure out if there could be counter bidding, maybe, a kind of bidding war again within the middle of that moment in order to see who the captain really ends up with. But the idea that your captain can be suborned away from you is something we want in the game, 100%.
Yes, absolutely. The other kind of obvious external problem is, of course, pressure from outside powers. So, just for people who aren't super familiar with this period, who are our main outside powers, and how are we trying to get them into this game?
So we picked four that we think are the most, salient to the whole situation, and the ones you couldn't really do without. There are others. Obviously, you could get more granular than we will get, but we just think that wouldn't serve the game, which we want to be kind of freewheeling, exciting,
Yeah, and there's already
paranoia inducing.
a lot going on, so we gotta like figure out where our cuts are gonna happen here.
Exactly. So the four powers we're including, one would be the French. So at the beginning bookend of the game in 1494, Charles VIII of France makes his way down into Italy to pursue various claims, including some historic claims on Naples, which of course doesn't make the Aragonese happy because they're the ones in charge of Naples at that point. So Charles starts moving, down through Italy, passing different cities, basically intimidating them with the possibility of conquest, in order to, carve up as much of Italy as he can, and to put particular pressure on Milan and Florence. In addition to his aims in Naples, which he realizes may be hard to realize, hard to achieve. The other great power we're looking at are the Spanish. So I mentioned the Aragonese in Naples. And of course, the Spanish family has the papacy at the beginning of our game. So the Spaniards certainly very important to the whole story. They too can make their way over to Italy in pursuit of conquests. Um, Sometimes even to keep their own dynasties in line, like the Aragonese in Naples occasionally will feel pressure from Spain proper to stay, kind of a vassal to Spain. Then we have the Holy Roman Empire, of course, that I never forget because this is not the only person who's probably ever heard this joke. But my high school teacher said it wasn't really an empire, it was a weird federation of states. It wasn't really Roman, it was located in what is now Germany, and it sure as hell wasn't holy. I mean, that was the old joke we got in high school. So that interesting political entity, fascinating, really, has its own pressure to exert on Italy. And eventually you get Charles V, the great Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, who will unite Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, which changes things up. And then the fourth power we have are the Ottomans, the Turks, who are, for the most part in our game, a threat on the high seas, which is particularly annoying to Naples, but above all to Venice, because Venice has its colonies in the Balkans, it needs its sea lanes open, and the Turks are constantly messing with that. So, what the game does is it treats those four powers as non player powers that you can occasionally try to manipulate and control to your ends, which these city states in Renaissance Italy often tried to do. They were the ones, usually one or more of them, who invited one of these great powers into Italy to bring order, stability, and to help achieve any objective that that city state had. And the idea was, well, I can tame the monster, right? I can bring in these great power armies and they'll work for me and they'll hurt my enemies. But of course, what ends up happening is they often hurt everybody and they have their own agendas. So it's a double edged sword. I mean, you want to bring in these great powers to pursue your objectives and to hurt your enemies, but you're also bringing in drama. You're bringing in trouble for Italy. And Machiavelli's thesis was, and I think on the eve of his death, he felt vindicated in this. His thesis was if you keep bringing in the great powers, the so called barbarians of old, right, people beyond the Alps, if you bring them into Italy, they will simply trample Italy and they will render Italy prostrate and they will, in essence, rape Italy, which was the metaphor that Machiavelli uses in The Prince. He didn't want to see that happen to Italy. He had a kind of vision of more Italian unity than existed at the time. Much like Petrarch and Dante, he had notions that Italy could get its act together and be unified. Does that mean in a modern nation state sense? Maybe not that, but certainly more unified than it was. And he felt like every time a great power was drawn into the to Italy, it undermined that goal. It just made Italians more at each other's throats and more unwilling to compromise. And by the time he died in 1527, he basically died uh, right when the sack of Rome was happening in 1527, one of the most traumatic events in the European imagination. It was kind of a 9/11 of its time. And what was so traumatic about it is imperial troops, the lanzknechts of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, not only attacked Rome to do battle with Pope Clement, the Medici Pope, but they also ended up sacking the whole city. And some of the reasons for the sack were now becoming religious because some of those troops coming over with the emperor were Protestants. And so they had a built in animosity to Catholics and to the papacy. And this kind of led to more atrocities, perhaps, than might have happened otherwise. So it was such a traumatic moment. And to Machiavelli, as he was dying, he was watching this happen and thinking, there you go. You bring in the outsiders and it tears us apart.
Oh, geez. So when we talk about like Italian, I guess identity as Italians as opposed to Florentines or Venetians or Neapolitans, how do you characterize like Italian national identity in this era, and like how long is it before Italy's Italy the way that we understand it?
That's a great question. And I'm more expert on the earlier periods than the 19th century. But when you think of the 19th century, the mid 19th century, when Italy is finally united as a nation under a kind of figurehead king. And you think of Garibaldi and all the freedom fighters who helped make that happen in 19th century Italy. They are operating under a significantly different paradigm, right? They're looking at the modern nation state as it was forming elsewhere. And Italy felt like it was lagging in that, right? And it needed that nation state identity in order to survive. What Machiavelli and Petrarch and Dante, people like that, are thinking of is not quite that specific. It's certainly not a modern nation state ideology, but they are thinking of unity in the sense of a common defense, unity in the sense of a common culture, despite all the linguistic dialect differences, all the cultural differences, all the local differences, which are still there in Italy to this day, right? The notion was that you should still see yourselves as Italians. And importantly for the Dantes, Petrarchs, and Machiavellis, is that you also see yourself in a sense as Romans, right? You are inheritors of the lost empire of old. And so Dante in particular thought that empire could be reborn, could be rebuilt like Humpty Dumpty, put back together again. And that was one reason he gravitated more towards the Holy Roman emperors than he did to the popes, whom he didn't trust. And Petrarch and Machiavelli as well are all kind of hostage to that mythology, right, of a reunified Italy, at least in spirit. Um, in fact, the ending of The Prince, the very last chapter, is written as if there will be some redemptive prince who will show up and come in and make that unity happen and kick out the outsiders. And what many scholars have pointed out, John Najami probably foremost among them, is while Machiavelli was fascinated with that idea in The Prince, and it kind of worked for the mythical, almost poetic way he wanted to end that book, in his other writings, he gets increasingly less confident in this idea of a mythical redemptive prince. He starts thinking more and more it's not going to happen with one person. It's not a Cesare Borgia or anyone else you name who's going to come in and magically save the day for Italy. He's increasingly convinced it's communities that will save the day for Italy. It's communal virtue, not individual virtue. And so our game hopes to take that part just as seriously. Like, I think you could make a really nasty, backstabby game based solely on the prince, and that would be fun. But I think more interesting is kind of this meditation on, again, stability and fragility and government. And this is why we have in the game something that is rather unique, we think, and that is a political traditions box.
I was
So
about to
you will
ask.
have a,
You're right on
yeah,
point.
there you go. So all the governments we have, right? We have merchant republics, we have theocracies, we have feudal aristocracies. What else am I missing? We have, let's see, merchant republics, feudal aristocracies, theocracies. We have vassal states.
Hmm.
We have tribute states, which are just kind of de facto recently conquered tribute states. And I'm probably missing one more. I don't know. It's my game, our game. We should know. But at any rate, as you change your governments in a given province in the game, you keep a stack of all the previous governments. So you'll know, okay, your state, Princeton, that was the other one. So if your current state is a princedom, beneath your princedom may be one, two, or more republics, previous regimes. So why do we do that? For one, it tells a story. So by the end of the game, you'll be able to point at any province on the map and say, here are all the political transformations it went through. And it could bounce back and forth like billiard balls between princedoms, theocracies, merchant republics. Florence is a good example. At the start of our game, it's a theocracy under Savonarola, the fiery preacher who gave the Pope so much headache. But then it eventually restores its republic and is a princedom. So any given province could have any number of these counters in its box. But aside from telling a story, what it also enables is a kind of modifier to when you try to change a government. So if you do what we call law giving, which Machiavelli thought was the highest civic function, not being a military general, not being just a prince, but being a lawgiver, somebody who gives institutions and order to a place. When you try to law give and change the government in a given province, you get modifiers if in the past that government was leaning the way you want it to go now. So a state used to being a republic in the past will be easier to bring back to a republic. and vice versa. If it's used to being a princedom, it's used to being under an autocratic ruler, then it's going to be easier to shift it that way. And this is directly out of The Prince. Machiavelli talks about republics in particular being very jealous of their liberties, their historic liberties. And he says that if you want to be a prince and come in and rule a republic, you'd better live there, first of all. If you're not there and you're not keeping an eye on them, they will revolt. And one of the reasons they'll revolt is they have such a deep memory of being free, or relatively free, in a republic. And you can't kill that instinct in them. It's hardwired in them because of generations of living under that type of government. So some provinces in the game will be very inured to autocracy. Some will be very inured to being a republic. And some, like Rome itself, basically is a theocracy, right, under the papacy, the seat of Western Christendom. So that would be a very hard state to shift away from a theocracy. But all that said, we've allowed the possibility that any province can become anything in the game. It may be an unusual outcome, it may be a difficult outcome, but we wanted to keep that sense of flexibility because really that's what Renaissance Italy was. It wasn't just a bunch of independent city-states, all with a similar kind of government. No, they had very radically different governments, and it caused them to be distrustful of governments they weren't familiar with. If you think to the Peloponnesian War, right? One of the motivations for the Spartans is they can't understand and certainly can't abide the idea of Athenian democracy. It just seems absurd and monstrous to them. So that sense of not trusting the political system of your neighbor and thinking, well, maybe I ought to conquer them so I can give them the right political system, that is part of the game. So it's a whole other dimension of the play that we wanted to be in there, which is that political side of things, not just a military side of things.
Yes, and so you mentioned the Papal States. This is something that if we could possibly make this work in this game, I want it so bad.
I know where you're going, and we
Which
will
is
make it work.
so, as y'all can see, like we're in the phase where we've got tons of ideas built in. We're gonna have to test out, right? And see like what needs streamlining, what stays. Hopefully lots of like this stuff stays. I think it's so rich, but I desperately want every time there's a papacy change to have players vote from some options on who the next pope is, because the hardest thing about being the papal states is that you don't have full control internally over who the next pope is. Like you start with a Borgia pope. And so Paul, what are some like when you look at popes of this time period, they have like these very different goals and like family origins and political alliances. So like what kinds of things historically could that do? And then what are we thinking about like putting into gameplay?
That's such a great question. And I'll give you a little context before I answer that part. In terms of other things that will be in the game, besides your normal event flow that you see in most coin or ICS games, we will also have what are called pivotal events. Anyone who knows Fire in the Lake will know what pivotal events are. They are one-shot big events that you have to get certain conditions met in order to play, but they let you basically play that pivotal event for your faction over the existing event that's on deck right now. So those who know Fire in the Lake know that those can be very powerful things. We're going to have those as well, but they will be, in a sense, dual-sided. So you'll have a choice between two types of pivotals. So that's one type of card we're adding in addition. The other that gets more directly relevant to Liz's question is leader cards. So this is something I really liked in People Power. Those who know probably a lesser known coin game that isn't on Vassal yet, and I really wish it were. It's about the Philippines in the 80s, and so all the turmoil there. And one of the cool things in that game is you have leader cards for each faction that you can choose. You can choose a particular leader to go in for a particular era of the game, and that leader will have varying focus, right? So might be someone oriented to military activity, or in the case of that game, insurgency or whatever. The others might be more oriented to collecting more income or whatever it is. So this idea of leaders that can shape your strategy and changing those leaders up is something we wanted in the game as well. I had always had the instinct that some leaders who are political, not just mercenary captains, would be very good for the game. And I'm more convinced of that than ever. All four of the five factions, other than Rome, right, will have more flexibility in the leaders they choose to install. They'll have to meet conditions. I mean, it's not an automatic, but you'll have some agency in shaping who you want to be in charge. So you start in Florence, for example, with Savonarola, and he will give you certain advantages. But there'll come a point where you're just tired of him and you want somebody else to do something different. You'll switch out your leader. But we thought together, Liz and I, and anyone who's seen the recent movie Conclave, we thought it would be great if the papacy didn't have the fullest authority to simply change their pope. They would have an edge. We want to weight it to give them some power over it. But every other city state in the game, every other faction, has a right to vote on the conclave and figure out who the next leader of the papacy will be, which can dramatically impact the papacy's planning. If you have Alexander the Sixth, the Borgia Pope, the father of Cesare Borgia, he's got some military ambitions, but he's also looking to keep Christendom in line. He's looking to get tithes. He's looking to eliminate rival theocracies like Savonarola's in Florence. So he has a particular profile as a leader. You may at some point want to switch to Pope Julius II of the Della Rovere family, who was a bitter rival of the Borgias. They hated each other. And it took Julius some time to actually become Pope. One thing that helped, of course, was Alexander VI dying and Cesare Borgia, his son, having less power and influence. So eventually Pope Julius became Pope. And he became known as this warrior Pope, definitely went on the offensive and definitely took it upon himself to create a big coalition to humble the Venetians because he thought they were out of hand. So if you want that warrior Pope, you want Pope Julius earlier perhaps than was the case historically, because we're allowing that these are leader types, not necessarily the specific historical people. So things may roll out in a way that is not a historical, strictly speaking. But if you want to shift emphasis to that new kind of leader and you're the papacy, you're going to need buy-in from the other factions. You're going to need a critical mass of votes to get the Pope you want. And that, of course, will involve bribing them, paying them off, making deals, maybe making an alliance with them. We do give the power of two powers to the Pope that they had historically. One is excommunication. We're trying to figure out how best to model that in game terms. The original idea, which came from Avalon Hill's old diplomacy riff, Machiavelli, which is fascinating in its own way, and is mostly out of print, I think. But the way excommunicate worked there is if you were excommunicated by the Pope, you couldn't talk for a certain period of time to anybody. We're trying to figure out if we can do anything quite that onerous or how we would wrinkle it, but we want excommunication to be a weapon of the Pope. And the other is interdiction, which people don't know quite as well. Wargamers think of interdiction in particular ways related to zone of control and other things. But for late medieval Renaissance popes, what interdiction means is you basically punish an entire city for their bad behavior. So Florence continuing to support Savonarola, Alexander VI put them under interdiction. What does that mean? You can't have sacraments in that city. You are cut off from last rites. You're cut off from the day-to-day sacraments that matter so much to Christians. And you might think, well, big deal. We'll do a sacrament on the side. Nobody will know. It was a big deal then, and it had an economic impact. For example, if you're a merchant traveling all the way from Italy or maybe abroad, right? You're coming from England, and you're going to a city under interdiction, and you worry about catching a disease or just dying from any cause, you can't get your last rites because that city is under interdiction, and therefore your soul is forfeit. So
Oh,
there are reasons people don't want to be under interdiction. It can kill the economy of a town. So the Pope has very powerful tools at his disposal, but he also has to get buy-in from the rest of the factions to decide which Pope's going to be in charge. And that is unlike the other factions. We wanted it to feel really different playing the papacy.
oh man, priest on strike. Everybody gets a strike. So, I felt like I wanted to record this because I kind of wanted this snapshot in time of like all the things that we're thinking of and excited about right now. So, this game is going to be getting tested in coming months and adjusted, and we intend to be pretty open, I guess, about the process of like how it's doing and where it's at. But in the meantime, if people are very interested in this topic. So you mentioned the Machiavellian moments. What are some other kind of good, I guess, introductory readings that people can do if they want to dig in to the Italian Wars and to Machiavelli's theories and understandings of his times, and of course,
Yeah,
Pope drama?
and Pope drama, yes. Well, another book that comes to mind on Machiavelli is called Foxes and Lions. And Foxes and Lions, by the way, for those who might not know, Machiavelli talks about this in The Prince, and this is why we chose the title. Machiavelli says princes need to avail themselves of the nature of the lion, the aggressor, the figure of wrath and military power. They have to be able to tap into that when necessary. But he says they would be ill served and ultimately fail if they don't also tap into another animal's qualities, and that's the fox. So you have to be able to tap into the deceitful, tricky, manipulative side of yourself, the ability to fight without open warfare, but to fight behind the scenes. So he says princes have to be both. They have to be both foxes and lions if they're going to thrive. And there is a great book on Machiavelli called Foxes and Lions by Wayne Rebhorn, Rebhorn, which gets into this idea of Machiavelli as the trickster, Machiavelli as the confidence man, Machiavelli as the fox, not just as the lion. And it's a really nice overview of his thinking. Another one by Hannah Pitkin, Pitkin, which gets into the history of the period, not just Machiavelli, is called Fortune is a Woman, which is a famous thing Machiavelli says in The Prince. And it's a really interesting historical look at the period and at Machiavelli, but it also kind of takes a slightly feminist view of the rhetoric and the language that Machiavelli uses to talk about women in general, but fortune in particular, because he suggests that you have to get rough with fortune in order to overcome fortune. And it's, by our modern standards, a kind of unsettling part of The Prince from our modern perspective on gender. But it is real, and that's important to understanding Machiavelli's very kind of masculine-driven worldview. Even the word virtu, right, has the, as Liz
Yeah.
knows, the Latin word vir built into it. So
Yeah.
manliness is already built into the idea.
Yeah, like Latin virtus, like the origin word is like a manly sort of strength. It's not considered a feminine trait. To
That's
their
right.
loss, in my opinion. But
Yes. And there will be some powerful women in our event cards and in sort of leadership orbit in the game. So we're not going to overlook the role of women. Caterina Sforza comes in mind, who famously stood on the battlements of her own citadel when she was being sieged, and they had some of her children hostage down on the ground level. And she basically lifted her skirts to the enemy on top of the battlements and said, "You see what I have here? I can make more kids." Which was a horrible thing to hear your mom saying, like, basically, I could afford to lose a few, right? But she really meant to say, right, that you're not going to intimidate me simply by taking my loved ones hostage, right? I'm not going to bend. I'm not going to submit to you just for that. So, some extraordinary, interesting women in the time that hopefully can be woven a bit into the game as well. As far as your question, Liz, about where we're at, so whatever this means to people in game design world or software development world, we are at version 1.5 right now of the rules. The rules are written, they're complete, but of course, many parts of them will see changes and, or at least tweaking. We have a developer friend that we're working with who's helping us think that through, which is very
yes,
helpful.
we
We
have a
have, I don't
map.
know if you want to name, I don't know if you want to
No,
name, but
no, not yet. We have a
not right now.
map,
Yeah,
we have action menus. Like, I mean, basically, we're at the point where we just need to find victims to play this with
that's right. And we have
instead of just
friends
listening.
in Minnesota and Philadelphia, where we both are. We have friends that are going to certainly be playing it sooner than later. We also are going to be at Circle DC in Washington in late March, where that's the first opportunity. If you're joining that conference, convention, whatever, which is awesome, I highly recommend. We will have a demo of the game there, so you can try it out there. That'll be its first truly public outing. And by that point, it'll already have seen a lot of tweaks because my playtest group is certainly very supportive and love the game already from what they've read, but they are also very blunt and very honest, and they will tell me what can be better, which we need. right? We know it's nowhere near done. Takes time to do this right.
Yeah, especially since this is a heavier one. So for me, what's interesting about this is a task, right? It's like this is my general tastes in making things so far have run light. But as you know, like I play a full range of games. So it's about time to figure out how to get down to brass tacks and make something that's much heavier than what I have bitten off before. So I'm excited about it actually, and I'm very excited to be doing it with you. Like I feel like John Truitt introduced us before a game development conference for
Yeah,
Reactor Cast years ago. That was just like a fantastic intro. So
it was. It means the world to me because I'll be honest. I was making progress on it, but it was glacial progress, partly due to life and a million other things going on, but also just you get to a point where you sort of feel stuck. And I would never have developed to the point where it's at now without you, Liz. It would not be what it is turning into without you. So, you in a sense rescued a game that was always a great idea, but needed to take that next step to a prototype. So I'm eternally grateful for that. And as you said, it's probably heavier than games you've worked on before, but our goal is to make it not so heavy as to be off-putting to your new player. We want it to be engaging, fast-playing, to be fun. If you think about the complexity scale of coin, Fire in the Lake and Pendragon, I think would be on one end, and
yeah.
Cuba Libre and People Power maybe would be on the other end. We're somewhere in between that. We haven't figured out exactly where, but we want to be in between that because we want a large audience and we want people to try and jump into this and play it and experiment with it. We suspect they're going to come up with things in playtesting or even someday after publication that we never thought of, right? People will come up with unique plans. One other thing, because I just don't want to lose this mechanic from the conversation. You can go into debt, you can borrow from the money lenders, and you can really make your life miserable if you don't pay back. And it will be very tempting to do that for people,
Yes, as it was historically. We have a lot
as
of
it
like
was.
fantastic examples of people deciding they're absolutely gonna take that payday loan.
Yeah, and it is. The terms are not fair. I mean, it's high interest, believe me.
Yes, but hey, you gotta make your money somehow because the kings in other countries could also just default on your Italian bank at any time. So,
That's right.
hopefully y'all will be joining us for like further, I guess, further steps of this journey into like the sort of just such a colorful and chaotic and interesting time period. And I'm really looking forward to us like continuing to figure out how to express that through Fox's Alliance.
Yeah, very exciting.
All right. Paul, thanks for coming on. I mean,
Thank you.
thanks for inviting me to like be part of this project because I feel like you had a proposal that I loved, and now it's like turning into like it's a
It,
game now.
it's manifesting in the world, as they say.
And for those of you who are out there, Paul, if you want to be reached for questions, like where can you be found right now?
Sure. And I just got a new work email, so I'm literally going to pull it up and make sure I have it right. It is, bear with me, it is Wright, so Pwright at mainlineclassical.org. So that's MAINLINE classical.org. And I teach at Mainline Classical Academy, which is an independent school in the Philadelphia area. So that's probably the best place to reach me.
Excellent. Everybody should mainline their classics. And
That's
uh,
right.
I, of course, can be found anywhere as Beyond Solitaire. And, we're happy to brainstorm, talk, share about this one because we're excited about it and we're having a good time. So you're welcome to join in. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. This is, of course, now the end of season 9 of the Beyond Solitaire podcast, but I'll be back with season 10 in 2025. So fear not, we're going on break for a bit, but we will return, and this will give me time to make some more event cards, Paul. But
Always more. We always want more.
all right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening all season long in this episode in particular. Everybody go have good holidays, play some games, and don't forget to keep asking questions because that's what we do here. Catch you later, everybody.